At 5:33 in the morning, October 23, 1944, the Japanese Empire launched its final great naval offensive of the Pacific War. 4 days later, over 12,000 Japanese sailors would be dead, 4 aircraft carriers would be sunk, multiple battleships destroyed, and the Imperial Navy would effectively cease to exist as an offensive force. But according to many historians, the battle that doomed Japan didn't begin at Leyte Gulf. It began in darkness, inside a narrow stretch of water called Palawan Passage. Because in just 21 minutes, 2 American submarines shattered the command structure of Japan's most important fleet, sank Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's flagship beneath him, and triggered a chain reaction of confusion, hesitation, and collapse that the Japanese Navy would never recover from. The worst part? Kurita survived. Pulled from burning oil while hundreds of his sailors disappeared beneath the sea, the admiral who was supposed to lead Japan's final counterattack would spend the next 2 days commanding one of the largest naval forces on Earth while psychologically unraveling in front of it. And by the time the shooting stopped at Leyte Gulf, an empire built over decades had collapsed into smoke, wreckage, and silence. This is the story of the 21 minutes that may have ended Imperial Japan's Navy forever. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe. Because stories like this are slowly disappearing into history, every single day we uncover real World War II battles, forgotten operations, and the moments that changed the Pacific War forever, many of which most people have never even heard about. By October 1944, the Japanese Empire was running out of time. American forces had shattered Japan's outer defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Saipan had fallen, Guam had fallen, Tinian had fallen. Every island lost brought American bombers closer to Tokyo, but the real disaster was happening at sea. American submarines had turned Japan's shipping lanes into graveyards. Tankers vanished weekly. Cargo convoys disappeared into the Pacific without warning. Oil shortages became so severe that parts of the Imperial Navy remained anchored simply because there was not enough fuel left to move them. Still, Japanese leadership believed one decisive battle could reverse the war. The plan was called Operation Shogo, Victory Operation. Its objective was brutally simple: destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte before U.S. forces could secure the Philippines. If successful, thousands of American troops could be stranded on exposed beaches without supply or reinforcement. Tokyo hoped catastrophic losses might force the United States into negotiations. Everything depended on timing. 3 separate Japanese fleets would attack from different directions, while a northern carrier force lured Admiral Halsey away from Leyte Gulf. At the center of the operation was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan still possessed: 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, destroyers stretching across the horizon, including Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built. If Kurita reached Leyte intact, the consequences for American forces could be devastating. But before reaching the Philippines, his fleet had to pass through Palawan Passage. American submariners called those waters Submarine Alley. The geography was ideal for ambushes. Deep channels forced large fleets into predictable movement while reefs restricted maneuvering space. Submarines could wait silently beneath the surface and strike at close range before disappearing into darkness. Kurita understood the danger, but he feared delay more. Every hour lost increased the chance American reconnaissance would discover the operation. What he didn't know was that American submarines had already found him. Hours earlier, radar operators aboard USS Darter detected multiple contacts moving across their screens. Then more appeared. Then dozens. Commander David McClintock stared at the radar in disbelief. This was not a convoy, it was an armada. Immediately, he radioed USS Dace, another American submarine nearby. "We've got multiple contacts." Inside both submarines, tension exploded instantly, because everyone understood what this meant. If confirmed, they had just located the largest concentration of Japanese naval power remaining in the Pacific. But there was a problem. The Japanese fleet was moving too quickly for underwater interception. To reach firing position before dawn, both submarines would have to surface and race ahead through open water at maximum speed. It was extremely dangerous. Japanese destroyers carried radar, and one detection could force the submarines underwater long before they reached attack range. McClintock made the decision immediately: surface, full speed ahead. Diesel engines roared alive as both submarines cut through black water trying to intercept the Japanese formation before sunrise. Then came the radio transmission that changed the entire campaign. Enemy fleet sighted, composition confirmed, heading east. That message reached Admiral Halsey hours before the Japanese realized they had been detected. Operation Shogo had already lost its greatest advantage: surprise. Still, Kurita's fleet continued toward Palawan Passage, unaware American submarines were now directly ahead. To preserve formation timing, Kurita issued a decision that looked reasonable on paper and catastrophic in reality. The fleet would temporarily stop zigzagging. Instead of constantly changing course to avoid submarine attacks, the ships continued in a steady, predictable formation through darkness. To submarine commanders, it was almost unbelievable, a perfect target line. Before dawn, USS Darter and USS Dace finally submerged into attack position. Inside Darter, noise disappeared instantly. Diesel engines shut down. Voices dropped to whispers. Men leaned over torpedo calculators, plotting speed, distance, and firing angles while stopwatches ticked quietly in the darkness. Then McClintock raised the periscope. At first he saw destroyers, then cruisers, then battleships emerging from darkness one after another, an entire Japanese fleet passing directly in front of him. And then one ship filled the entire lens, larger than the others, leading the formation itself, the heavy cruiser Atago, Vice Admiral Kurita's flagship. At that moment, the fate of Japan's final naval offensive narrowed to less than 1,000 yards, and beneath the surface, American torpedoes were already moving into position. The next 21 minutes would change the Pacific War forever. At 5:24 a.m., USS Darter drifted silently beneath the surface of Palawan Passage, while the largest Japanese naval force remaining in the Pacific moved directly overhead. Inside the submarine, voices dropped to whispers. Red emergency lights illuminated exhausted faces as Commander David McClintock watched through the periscope. Every calculation had already been made: distance, speed, angle, spread. Now everything depended on timing. Through the lens, Japanese destroyers emerged first, then cruisers, then the massive silhouette of Atago, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's flagship. The ship filled the periscope completely, less than 1,000 yards away. To submarine commanders, it was an almost perfect shot. What McClintock didn't realize was that the fate of Japan's entire operation now rested inside his crosshairs. Earlier in the war, American submariners had feared the Mark 14 torpedo almost as much as the enemy. Faulty detonators and defective depth controls caused countless attacks to fail. By late 1944, those problems had finally been fixed. Now, when American torpedoes hit, ships died. McClintock steadied himself against the periscope. Fire 1. The submarine jolted violently. Fire 2. Another torpedo surged into darkness. Fire 3. 6 torpedoes raced toward the Japanese formation. Then came the silence. Inside Darter, sailors stared at stopwatches while the submarine drifted deeper beneath the surface. Nobody moved. Then the ocean erupted. The first torpedo slammed into Atago's starboard side beneath the bridge. Fire and steam exploded upward as boiler rooms disappeared instantly beneath twisted steel. Seconds later, another torpedo detonated farther aft. The cruiser shuddered violently. Lights flickered. Then sections of the flagship went dark. Inside Atago, confusion spread immediately. Steam lines burst. Smoke flooded passageways. Phones stopped working. Damage control teams rushed into darkness while officers struggled to understand the scale of the attack. Then another explosion tore through the ship. The list to starboard increased rapidly. Experienced sailors immediately understood what it meant. The flagship was dying. Around them, the Japanese formation collapsed into chaos. Destroyers accelerated through darkness searching for submarines while cruisers attempted emergency maneuvers inside the narrow passage. But the ambush wasn't over. Several thousand yards away, USS Dace launched its own torpedo, spread at the heavy cruiser Maya. Multiple hits struck almost instantly. Within minutes, Maya began sinking. Now, Kurita's force had lost 2 major cruisers before reaching the battlefield, and nobody knew how many submarines were attacking. Inside Atago, conditions became catastrophic. Decks tilted sharply, smoke-filled corridors. Sailors climbed through shattered openings searching for escape routes while others disappeared below decks forever. Admiral Kurita realized the ship could no longer survive. The commander of Japan's most important naval operation climbed through a damaged window and jumped into the sea as his flagship collapsed around him. Moments earlier, he had commanded the largest Japanese fleet remaining in the Pacific. Now he floated in burning oil while hundreds of sailors screamed in darkness around him. Then Atago rolled further onto her side. For a brief moment, her propellers rose above the water. At 5:54 a.m., only 21 minutes after the attack began, the flagship capsized completely and disappeared beneath the Pacific. More than 300 sailors went down with her. Beneath the surface, American submariners listened quietly as explosions echoed through the water. The attack had lasted less than half an hour, but the psychological damage had only begun. Because somewhere in the darkness, Vice Admiral Kurita had just watched the heart of Japan's final offensive vanish beneath the sea. And from that moment forward, nothing about the battle would go according to plan. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita was pulled from the water covered in oil, exhausted and nearly silent. Only minutes earlier, he had stood aboard the bridge of Atago, commanding the most powerful Japanese surface fleet remaining in the Pacific. Now his flagship was gone. Hundreds of sailors had vanished with it, and the operation Japan hoped would save the empire had already descended into confusion before reaching the battlefield. Destroyers circled through burning debris searching for survivors while the rest of the fleet struggled to maintain formation in darkness. Signal lamps flashed between ships. Officers shouted conflicting instructions across radios already overwhelmed by chaos. For nearly an hour, the Japanese advance slowed to a crawl. Time was the one thing Operation Shogo could not afford to lose. The entire offensive depended on synchronization between multiple fleets moving across enormous distances. Every delay increased the risk that American naval forces would regroup before Kurita reached Leyte Gulf. But the attack off Palawan had done more than sink ships. It had shattered momentum. Kurita was eventually transferred to the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever constructed. Towering above the fleet like a floating fortress, the battleship represented the pride of the Imperial Navy. But even aboard Yamato, something had changed. Witnesses later described Kurita as unusually quiet after the sinking of Atago. Officers noticed hesitation where confidence had existed before. Communication became slower. Decisions took longer. The admiral who had once pushed aggressively through danger now appeared cautious, distracted, almost haunted. And the worst part was still ahead. Because while Kurita reorganized his damaged fleet, American commanders were already preparing the next attack. Hours earlier, the submarine contact reports from USS Darter had reached Admiral Halsey's headquarters. By dawn, American carrier groups were launching reconnaissance aircraft across the Philippine Sea searching for Kurita's formation. They found it on October 24th in the Sibuyan Sea. What followed became one of the largest carrier air assaults of the Pacific War. Wave after wave of American aircraft descended onto the Japanese fleet from every direction. Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers attacked continuously throughout the day, while anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with smoke and exploding shells. At the center of the assault stood the battleship Musashi, one of the 2 largest battleships ever built. Massive, heavily armored, designed to survive exactly this kind of punishment. But American carrier aviation had transformed naval warfare faster than Japanese doctrine could adapt. Again and again, aircraft broke through defensive fire and struck the fleet. Bombs exploded across decks while torpedoes slammed into hulls beneath the waterline. Musashi absorbed catastrophic damage. Still, she continued forward. Then more aircraft arrived, and more after that. By afternoon, the giant battleship had taken so many hits that her speed collapsed. Flooding spread uncontrollably through lower compartments as the ship began listing heavily. Eventually, even Musashi could no longer survive. As darkness approached, the battleship rolled beneath the sea, taking more than 1,000 sailors with her. For Kurita, the sinking carried devastating psychological weight. In less than 48 hours, he had watched his flagship destroyed, multiple heavy cruisers lost, and now one of the greatest battleships in naval history disappear beneath the Pacific. Every stage of Operation Shogo was unraveling. Communication failures multiplied, formation discipline weakened, and American aircraft continued attacking almost without interruption. Still, Tokyo's orders remained unchanged: advance to Leyte, no matter the cost. Kurita obeyed. On the night of October 24th, his battered fleet continued through San Bernardino Strait toward the American invasion area. Ahead lay Leyte Gulf. Ahead lay hundreds of vulnerable American transports unloading troops and supplies onto the beaches. If Kurita reached them intact, the consequences could still be catastrophic for the United States. But aboard Yamato, doubt had already begun spreading through the Japanese command structure. Because the admiral leading Japan's final counterattack no longer trusted what he was seeing, the submarines off Palawan had done more than destroy ships. They had broken certainty itself. And by dawn, Kurita's fleet was about to encounter something no Japanese commander expected: a handful of small American escort carriers and destroyers standing directly between him and victory. At dawn on October the 25th, 1944, Kurita's battered fleet emerged from San Bernardino Strait and entered the waters off Samar. Ahead of them lay the American invasion area at Leyte Gulf, and directly in their path sailed a small American task group never meant to fight battleships. Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. Small, lightly armored ships designed mainly for anti-submarine patrols and close air support. Against Kurita's force, they should have been annihilated within minutes. The Japanese fleet still possessed battleships, heavy cruisers, and guns capable of firing shells weighing more than a ton. Some Japanese lookouts initially believed they had discovered part of Admiral Halsey's main carrier force. Then they realized the truth. The American ships were smaller, much smaller, easy targets. At 6:58 a.m., giant columns of water erupted around the escort carriers as Japanese battleships opened fire. The battle off Samar had begun. Aboard the American escort carrier Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague immediately understood the scale of the disaster. His tiny force had accidentally collided with one of the most powerful surface fleets on Earth, and there was nowhere to run. The escort carriers could barely reach 18 knots. Kurita's cruisers and battleships were faster, heavier, and massively superior in firepower. Still, Sprague gave the only order possible: run south, launch every aircraft, fight. American pilots took off carrying whatever weapons remained on board. Some aircraft launched with anti-submarine depth charges instead of armor-piercing bombs. Others carried almost no ammunition at all. It did not matter. Anything that could slow the Japanese advance became a weapon. Meanwhile, American destroyers turned directly toward the enemy fleet. The destroyer USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, charged into the attack almost immediately. It was effectively suicidal. Johnston displaced barely 2,000 tons. Ahead of her stood battleships weighing more than 60,000. Still, Evans pushed forward through exploding shell splashes and launched a full spread of torpedoes toward the Japanese cruisers. The attack forced several enemy ships into emergency evasive maneuvers. For the first time that morning, the Japanese formation began losing cohesion, and then the Americans did something Kurita never expected. They kept attacking. Destroyers charged directly into cruiser gunfire at point-blank range. Escort carriers launched aircraft continuously despite being hopelessly outmatched. Pilots made repeated attack runs even after running out of ammunition. Some aircraft performed fake bombing passes simply to force Japanese ships to maneuver. Others dropped empty fuel tanks because they had nothing else left. The sea dissolved into smoke, fire, and confusion, and inside that confusion, Kurita began losing control of the battle. Reports flooded into Yamato's bridge from every direction. Cruisers damaged, destroyers separated, enemy aircraft attacking constantly, torpedoes in the water, ships maneuvering independently, visibility collapsing beneath smoke and rain squalls. The carefully organized Japanese formation that had survived Palawan and the Sibuyan Sea now fragmented completely. And psychologically, Kurita was already exhausted. The sinking of Atago still haunted him. The loss of Musashi still lingered in his mind. Now, surrounded by smoke and chaos, he struggled to determine what kind of American force he was actually fighting. Some Japanese officers believed larger U.S. carrier groups might still be nearby. Others feared another trap. The uncertainty became paralyzing. Meanwhile, the Americans continued fighting with almost reckless aggression. USS Johnston absorbed shell after shell while continuing to fire back at cruisers many times her size. USS Hull charged directly toward Japanese battleships, launching torpedoes at suicidal range before being torn apart by heavy gunfire. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, one of the smallest warships present, attacked so aggressively that Japanese observers later believed they were fighting a much larger vessel. The battle no longer made sense. Tiny American ships fought like they were trying to stop an invasion of the United States itself. And slowly, the momentum of the Japanese attack began collapsing. Kurita watched the growing chaos from Yamato's bridge surrounded by smoke, incomplete reports, and constant air attacks. Somewhere deep in his mind, the disaster at Palawan returned again, the burning oil, the sinking flagship, the feeling that the fleet was already slipping beyond control. Then came the moment that changed everything. At 9:20 a.m., after nearly 2 hours of combat, Kurita issued an order that shocked even his own officers: turn north, regroup, retreat. The attack on Leyte Gulf stopped. And just like that, Japan's final chance to destroy the American invasion fleet began slipping away into smoke and distance. If you're enjoying the documentary so far, hit the like button. It genuinely helps the channel continue making World War II documentaries like this, and helps these stories reach more people who still care about history. For several seconds after Kurita's order, nobody aboard Yamato spoke. Turn north, regroup, retreat. Even members of his own staff struggled to believe what they had just heard. Ahead of them lay vulnerable American transports packed with fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and thousands of soldiers unloading onto the beaches of Leyte. The original objective of Operation Shogo was still technically within reach, but Kurita no longer saw opportunity, he saw disaster. Smoke covered the horizon. American aircraft continued attacking from every direction. Reports arriving aboard Yamato were incomplete and contradictory. Some Japanese ships had become separated entirely from formation. The battle had dissolved into confusion, and deep down, Kurita no longer trusted the situation unfolding around him. Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi reportedly urged him to continue the attack. Other officers believed the Americans were collapsing and only needed one final push before the invasion fleet could be destroyed. But Kurita hesitated. The submarines off Palawan had changed something fundamental inside the Japanese command structure. Before Atago sank, Kurita had advanced aggressively despite enormous risks. Afterward, every threat appeared larger. Every unknown contact looked dangerous. Every delay created uncertainty. The confidence necessary to command a decisive fleet battle had begun eroding long before Samar. Now it finally broke completely. As the Japanese fleet turned away, many officers aboard smaller ships could barely understand what was happening. Destroyers that had pushed deep into combat suddenly found themselves withdrawing while American escort carriers still burned behind them. Some Japanese captains believed victory had been abandoned within reach. Others quietly felt relief because the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The Imperial Japanese Navy was dying. Years of losses could no longer be replaced. Experienced pilots were gone. Fuel shortages crippled training and operations. American submarines controlled vast areas of the Pacific. U.S. carrier aviation now dominated nearly every major naval engagement. And despite the enormous power of ships like Yamato and Musashi, battleships themselves were becoming obsolete. The Pacific War no longer belonged to surface fleets. It belonged to submarines and aircraft. Kurita's withdrawal effectively ended Japan's last realistic chance to disrupt the American invasion of the Philippines. But elsewhere across the Pacific, Operation Shogo was collapsing even faster. To the south, Vice Admiral Nishimura's force entered Surigao Strait directly into an American trap. U.S. destroyers launched coordinated torpedo attacks before 6 American battleships opened fire across the narrow strait. It became the last battleship versus battleship engagement in naval history. The Japanese battleship Yamashiro was destroyed. So was Fuso. Most of Nishimura's force disappeared beneath the sea within hours. Meanwhile, to the north, Admiral Ozawa's decoy carrier force succeeded in luring Admiral Halsey away from Leyte, but the victory meant almost nothing. American carrier aircraft overwhelmed the Japanese carriers throughout October 25th. One after another, they were bombed, torpedoed, and sunk. Among them was Zuikaku, the final surviving Japanese fleet carrier that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Its sinking carried enormous symbolic weight. For many Japanese sailors, it felt like the final chapter of the Imperial Navy itself. By nightfall, 4 Japanese carriers were gone. Entire formations had ceased to exist, and Kurita's surviving ships were retreating northward through darkness after abandoning the operation they had been ordered to complete at all costs. The scale of the disaster became almost impossible to comprehend. Within 4 days, Japan lost multiple battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, numerous heavy cruisers, destroyers, hundreds of aircraft, and over 12,000 sailors. But many American naval historians later argued the true collapse began much earlier. Not at Samar, not at Surigao Strait, not even during the carrier attacks in the Sibuyan Sea. It began at 5:33 in the morning off Palawan Passage, because when USS Darter and USS Dace crippled Kurita's flagship in 21 minutes, they destroyed far more than a cruiser. They shattered the confidence holding the entire operation together. And from that moment forward, Japan's final offensive never fully recovered. By the evening of October 25, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist as a true offensive force. The surviving ships were still dangerous. Many remained heavily armed. Some, like Yamato, were still the largest warships on Earth. But the illusion of Japanese naval dominance was gone forever. Operation Shogo had failed completely, and the scale of that failure stunned even American commanders. For years, Japanese naval doctrine had revolved around one central belief: the decisive fleet battle. Japanese strategists imagined a massive confrontation somewhere in the Pacific, where enemy fleets would be weakened through attrition before finally being destroyed in a single overwhelming engagement. That vision had shaped the entire Imperial Navy. Battleships were designed for it. Cruisers were built around it. Admirals trained their entire careers for it. But by late 1944, warfare had changed faster than Japan could adapt. Aircraft carriers now projected power hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. Submarines hunted fleets before battles even began. Radar, reconnaissance aircraft, and long-range strikes made traditional surface formations increasingly vulnerable, and nowhere was that transformation more visible than Leyte Gulf. The Japanese still possessed courage. What they no longer possessed was strategic control of the Pacific. American submarines strangled supply lines. American aircraft controlled the skies. American shipyards replaced losses faster than Japan could even fuel surviving vessels. Every stage of Operation Shogo exposed those weaknesses simultaneously. At Surigao Strait, Japanese battleships sailed directly into radar-guided American gunfire. At Cape Engano, Japanese carriers became little more than sacrificial decoys. At Samar, heavily armed battleships failed to destroy tiny escort carriers protected mainly by courage and desperation. And at Palawan Passage, two submarines nearly decapitated the entire operation before the main battle even began. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was devastating. Vice Admiral Kurita survived the war, but historians continued debating his retreat from Samar for decades afterward. Some argued he made the only rational decision possible after suffering catastrophic losses and constant air attack. Others believed he abandoned the greatest opportunity Japan would ever have to strike the American invasion fleet directly. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. After the sinking of Atago, Kurita never commanded with the same certainty again. The loss of his flagship created more than operational confusion. It created fear. Fear of submarines beneath the surface, fear of hidden American carrier groups, fear of another catastrophic ambush waiting somewhere beyond the horizon, and fear spreads quickly inside damaged fleets. By the end of Leyte Gulf, thousands of Japanese sailors were dead. Entire crews disappeared with ships that had once symbolized the pride of the empire. Veteran officers who survived Midway, Guadalcanal, and years of brutal naval combat now watched the Imperial Navy collapse around them in a matter of days. Even victory no longer seemed imaginable. The Philippines would eventually fall, American bombers would move closer to Japan itself, and the surviving Japanese fleet would spend most of the rest of the war trapped by fuel shortages and overwhelming American air superiority. In many ways, Leyte Gulf marked the moment Japan lost the ability to meaningfully influence the outcome of the Pacific War. Afterward, the Imperial Navy could still fight isolated actions, but it could no longer stop the United States from advancing toward the home islands. American historian Samuel Eliot Morison later described the battle as the greatest naval engagement in history, not only because of its size, but because it represented the end of an era. Battleships no longer ruled the oceans, carrier aviation and submarines did, and the old world of giant surface fleets died violently in the waters surrounding the Philippines. Yet among all the disasters of Leyte Gulf, one image continued haunting survivors long after the war ended. A burning flagship rolling beneath black water at dawn. Because for many Japanese officers, that was the moment everything truly began collapsing. Not when the carriers sank, not when the battleships retreated, but when Atago disappeared beneath the Pacific in 21 minutes and took Japan's confidence with her. And decades later, the wreck still rests at the bottom of Palawan Passage, silent, broken, and still guarding the grave of an empire that believed itself invincible. Today, the wreck of Atago still lies beneath the waters of Palawan Passage. More than 80 years later, the cruiser remains where she fell, deep below the surface in darkness that sunlight never reaches. Coral now covers sections of the hull. Fish drift silently through shattered compartments that once held officers directing the largest Japanese naval operation of the Pacific War. Time transformed the flagship into a grave, but history never escaped what happened there. Because the destruction of Atago was never just about one cruiser sinking beneath the sea, it was about momentum, confidence, and the collapse of an empire already bleeding to death. When historians study Leyte Gulf, attention usually focuses on the massive battles, battleships firing across Surigao Strait, escort carriers fighting for survival off Samar, carrier aircraft swarming Japanese fleets from every direction. But many naval historians argue the outcome had already begun taking shape before those battles fully developed. It began in darkness beneath Palawan Passage, 2 submarines, 6 torpedoes, 21 minutes. That was all it took to cripple the command structure of Japan's final offensive. And psychologically, the damage may have been even worse than the physical destruction itself. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita survived the sinking of his flagship, but survivors later described him as deeply shaken afterward. Officers noticed hesitation replacing aggression, communication slowed. Decision-making became cautious and uncertain during the most critical naval operation Japan attempted in the final stage of the war. Whether trauma directly caused Kurita's retreat at Samar remains debated even today, but what cannot be debated is this: After Atago sank, Operation Shogo never recovered its original momentum. The Japanese fleet lost coordination, timelines collapsed, confusion spread from ship to ship, and every disaster afterward only deepened the sense that events were spiraling beyond control. Meanwhile, the United States Navy demonstrated something terrifyingly new about modern warfare. Massive fleets could now be crippled long before the main battle even began. Submarines hidden beneath the surface could destroy command structures in minutes. Carrier aircraft could strike from hundreds of miles away. Radar and reconnaissance made surprise increasingly difficult. The Pacific War had evolved into a form of industrialized naval warfare Japan could no longer match. And nowhere was that reality clearer than Leyte Gulf. By the end of the battle, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, multiple battleships, numerous cruisers and destroyers, hundreds of aircraft, and more than 12,000 sailors. The Imperial Navy never recovered. Most surviving ships spent the remainder of the war trapped by fuel shortages or destroyed during later American attacks near the Japanese home islands. Even Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, would eventually sail on a near-suicidal final mission toward Okinawa before being sunk by American aircraft in 1945. The age of Japanese naval power ended in stages, but one of its most important moments happened before sunrise off Palawan. Because sometimes wars do not turn on grand speeches or famous victories, sometimes they turn in silence beneath dark water. In the span of 21 minutes, 2 American submarines transformed one of the most ambitious naval operations in history into a chain reaction of confusion, fear, and collapse. And somewhere beneath the Pacific, the wreck of Atago still remains as proof that even the largest fleets on Earth can disappear faster than anyone believes possible. The ocean remembers everything. And in October 1944, it swallowed the future of the Imperial Japanese Navy whole. The ocean remembers everything. And somewhere beneath the waters of Palawan Passage, the wreck of Atago still rests in darkness, a reminder of the morning when 21 minutes changed the fate of the Pacific War forever. If this documentary changed the way you understand the Pacific War, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every single day we uncover real World War II stories, forgotten battles, naval disasters, hidden operations, and the moments that changed history forever. And if you made it this far, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from.